one of the most sort of beneficial sort of elements of this afternoon session will be the opportunity to look more specifically at your own ALM policy, and discuss this then within your sort of groups, and thinking about how you look at the interpretation of the policy, and thinking about how you navigate identification of need, and also thinking about how you look at ALP within your own context of your own setting. So this main focus now is going to be on policy for the rest of this afternoon. And we're very much going to think about what the policy says in terms of what the Welsh Government is saying, and then thinking about how that might look like within your own practice. And as Di mentioned earlier, at the very beginning of today, when he was talking about your assessment, and it is very much about the context of your own setting and from the lens of you as a practitioner within obviously very different settings. And we know from obviously some of your feedback today that you're in very different types of settings, which is really good as well. It's really helpful to really enrich some of these discussions that we're going to have at this very final part of the day. So like I said, hopefully some of you have been able to have a little bit of look at the Pebble Pad so far, but Meg, would you mind just sharing the first screen? Thank you. So this links to one of the activities that is within the Pebble Pad, which if you haven't had a chance to look at yet, obviously it's there for you to have a look at. And it just looks at some of the key kind of ALN or SEND codes. And what you're doing within this section is you're starting to unpack some of this terminology. And I suppose the acronyms really as well. And I know that I know it was that Lucy before in the Ask the Expert slot, she was very open about the fact that all these acronyms was part of that development of understanding of need at times as well. So it's really important that within this section we're starting to really think about the terminology that's used, and kind of your perception of them within the context of your own practice as well. So on the list here, there are just some key acronyms that you need to be aware of in terms of what is widely used across the UK as well as in Wales. So just to remember really that, you're thinking about your ALN within the Wales context, but also think about, what that counterpart SEND, which is used sometimes more widely, more of a UK term. And obviously we know that's a term that's more commonly used within England. So, and this, again, this is all within your Pebble Pad, but thinking about, your ALNCO role and then your SENCO role is something that we look at within this section of the readings. And then also thinking of the individual development plan. So remembering that's the approach that we have within Wales, whereas just across the border we've got the individual education plan, and also thinking about the EHCP, thinking about the education and healthcare plan that they have in England. And I suppose just a reminder really that is the fact the IDP is this idea of being a legally binding document, and the same with the EHCP plan. But also remembering that, and this is within the readings if you're not too sure, that the IEP, which is your individual education plan, is more of an in-house terminology that's used to create support systems for learners with needs in England, and that's not a legally developed document. And the IEP is more in-house provision, whereas your EHCP, in England, is actually, is navigated by the local authority as well. So just a few things that are in the readings for you to remember. Thanks, Meg. Can we just go to the next slide just so we can? Okay, so sorry, just one before, sorry. So obviously these are the terminologies that you'll be more aware of as we look at the comparison. So in the blue you can see here that's the Welsh Government terminologies that you'll be used to, and the acronyms that obviously all of you will be really probably quite aware of within your own setting at the moment. And in the black are the more England and UK based terms. Again, like I said, if you're not too sure of some of these terms, please refer to the Pebble Pad readings. And what's really useful is thinking about these terms in a minute and unpacking these and thinking about the context of your own setting and what they mean within your own setting. For example, as well, the DECLO and the AL and LO, I can't words out, sorry, the early years AL and LO roles, thinking about the fact that these are more recent roles as well. Thinking about, the DECLO as being more of the health board type of role. It's this idea of this more multi-agency type of approach. And obviously the idea was to kind of make this process a little bit more smooth within the context of using this more, holistic view. And then also with the ALN-LO role, thinking about how we look at this now from a more early years perspective. Obviously that they work much more closely now with, practitioners, but as also parents and carers. And very much this perspective now of the importance of looking at this early identification as well within the sector. Okay, so sorry, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour here, but just giving you a bit of an overview really as to what the readings are saying when you get to that point and kind of what we're going to look at this afternoon. Thanks, Meg. So just a few things really just to kind of draw out, which, some of you will already be quite aware of this when we look at differences across the legislation. So when we think in terms of similarities from the ALN code in Wales and the SEND code of practice, there are a few similarities that, that most of you probably are aware of, but the fact that both codes now go up to the age of 25, okay, so the 0 to 25, and that's across both, that both codes advocate and offer suggestions for identification, okay, something we're going to look at in a minute as well, and thinking about that within the context of your own settings. Similarities also around ALP, so this idea of, this provision that you put in place, or similar types of form of provision, as also being a basis for intervention and support for learners. So that's something that's very similar across both legislations. And also, lastly, that I've just highlighted on here is that both codes advocate for a multidisciplinary approach to support learners with ALN. So, for example, the Welsh Government have appointed the DECLOs, like I was discussing then, and the UK Government have appointed the DMOs to support provision. So they have these designated roles as well to help support this multidisciplinary approach. However, like I've highlighted here, there are a few differences, and just to make you aware that these are kind of the main ones which you'll read about as well within the Pebble Pad. That all students with ALN in Wales, will be given an IDP. I know this has still, been a process over the last few years, whereas this isn't necessarily the case in England. It doesn't mean that they would all have the equivalent of the EHCP plan. Also, that whilst the UK Stand Code refers to UK-based legislation as its legal, legally binding rights basis, to wider rights, the UNCRPD and the ALN Code also refers to broader rights framework. So we also draw upon the United Conventions of the Rights of the Child as well as the United Conventions of the Rights of the persons with disabilities. Also, just one last thing as well is that, learners with the EHCP in more England and UK approach sometimes, all their parents or carers may request a personal budget as well, which is slightly different, and that's something that isn't offered within Wales. Okay, so just a couple of things just to start this conversation later on. Thanks, Meg. Okay, so the main activity for the remainder of today that I think is really important and kind of really delving into, I suppose, kind of how all of you obviously are aware of the policy by now, and I'm sure you probably had time to have a little read around this as well, what we've given in the Pebble Pad, but also how different that will look from your own professional lens. So that's a big part of what we're going to look at today, and we're going to start thinking about elements of your own ALM policies within your own settings. So some of you might be in more specialist schools, some of you might be in primary education, secondary, further education, higher education. But then what we're thinking about then is thinking about how we can look at sort of comparisons across then your different sectors into how you approach some of this policy. Okay, so thanks, Meg. If I could just... Okay, so I'm going to give you 20 minutes, just the remaining part of today's session. And what I'd like you to do in your groups today is to think about, now there's two things I'd like you to discuss. The first one is I want you to really focus upon identification of ALN. So obviously we are aware of what the policy says, and we understand the code of practice and kind of what we need to be considering. But what does this look like within the context of your own setting? Okay, so I'd like you to first of all start that discussion about how you go about identifying the ALN. What sort of role then does the ALN co or the equivalent potentially in the setting that you're in? What is the role of them in these procedures in identification? And then think about, your practitioners or your class teachers, and then what their role is then within this identification process. Okay, I'd really like you to have those rich discussions here about what it looks like within your own context, and sort of discuss this amongst each other into maybe does this look quite differently within different contexts, and kind of maybe just kind of having a bit of an open conversation about, how these procedures are followed and how they're implemented. So that'll be really interesting to begin with. And then the second part, what I'd like you to do to follow on from that discussion, I'd like you then to talk about provision. So think about your ALP, so your additional learning provision. And within these conversations, I'd really like you to think about your own setting and how they have their ALN support policy in practice, or your code of practice. And then I want you to think about, how does your setting decide on additional learning provision? I know we've already had conversations in these national conferences before, and how this might look quite differently within the context of your own setting. Again, think about the role of the ALN Co in following these procedures. And lastly, think about the practitioners or the class teacher and what their role is in navigating ALP within your setting. Okay, so there's just a couple of things I'd like you to do. I'll pop them in a minute into the chat so you can refer back to them in your discussions. So I'll give you 20 minutes, just the remaining 20 minutes of the session, if that's okay. And then if we've got time, we'll have a little bit of a feedback, if that's okay. Thank you. Christina, would you mind popping them in?